under the carpet because things are fundamentally different for a variety of reasons than they've been in other situations in history where there have been high GDP to or debt to GDP ratios. The most important one is the most important difference is that people simply don't believe it. I mean, after the Second World War, sure, debt was very high, but everyone was willing to still lend money to the governments because of what? Because they knew the governments were going to pay them that money back. I mean, there was budget discipline back then. Now, no one believes that for a second. I mean, we have, politicians have demonstrated with all possible clarity during the last expansion, where things were going really well, that they are utterly unable to pay back any amount of debt. So the markets don't believe it, and neither should we, and therefore this is fundamentally different and it needs to be tackled. Now, it may also be said, of course, that the UK's debt to GDP ratio of the world only just doubled, and it did actually from 2007 to today. It went from 33 to 66%. But if you include all the bailouts, all the handouts to the financial sector, it went to 148%. Now that's a much larger number right there. And you may say that's not so bad. Well, it's not so bad. Well, look at France, look at Italy. Forget about Greece, forget about Portugal. It's true, these are real examples that may frighten us too much. It's not really close to the UK. But Italy is. If you go back just a couple of years before the government's quite early and very decisive action, we were sort of in the mid-league, together with France and Italy. They now pay twice the interest we do. Now I'm talking about the French. The Italians pay 3 to 4 times as much. And I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and what it all pans out to is we're now paying yearly around 46.8 billion only in interest payments on debt. Now imagine that the big bad wolf comes and bites us, and we become closer to Italy, that our interest rates go up, that people who are supposed to buy this debt say, hey, we're not going to buy it, we don't trust you anymore, we need a higher rate of interest. Then imagine that happens, that means that our interest rate triples. Then this yearly debt payment jumps to 146 billion. And that number, ladies and gentlemen, is more than the combined total of our entire healthcare spendings, so the NHS and so on, and our entire educational budget, including all having to do with universities and schools. That's how big a difference we're talking about. So forget about expectations, forget about these sorts of fears and that. This is a real problem. This is a real problem. This is like a tank. It's like the Panzer SS division rolling over a little happy rose, essentially. So you may lift the expectations a little bit, of course, by being more jolly. But in doing so, people may not cooperate. There may not be this reduction in debt. And then the tank is absolutely going to hammer us. So the problem is real. And so what is damaging the economy is not any government-imposed culture of fear. The economy is damaged, and there is fear, and there should be fear. It would be hard not to be pretty terrified, actually, given what I just told you here. But that fear is not created by the government. All the government does is tell us the truth about these things so that we can solve these things together, and so that we will cooperate and not riot when we do so.
Right, well, thank you very much. And interesting enough, Martin just said, well, that markets aren't stupid. Well, I think we can see from recent experience they're not always completely smart either. It wasn't the ordinary public who were buying derivatives and taking up the money from all of those non-performing loans that were made to people who were never going to pay them. He also said that in the good times, governments didn't pay back their debt. Yet he said that at the start of the recession after Lehman Brothers, our debt ratio was about 34%. It had actually gone down to that figure. It was only by 2009 that British government debt got back to the levels of 97. And in fact, for example, everybody with their 3G phones now, when the British government auctioned off the 3G spectrum, Rather than using that money for current expenditure or even capital expenditure, it was actually used to pay down the debt. And that's exactly the reason why we have lower debt ratios, which I'll come back to, than nearly all the other European countries. And I'd really like to congratulate actually the organisers tonight for being so perceptive. They should really get jobs in forecasting in the city, in arranging the debate tonight on a day when on a week when the data has been so horrific for the British economy, including that horrific figure of 1 million youngsters unemployed, a complete waste and damage to a generation. But someone else who foresaw how things would pan out was Ed Balls. Now, you've probably all got pretty bored with Ed saying that the government are cutting too deep and too fast. And it's interesting, but I suspect that by the end of the debate, that people might actually think that he might have been right. He was right on the euro as well, of course, in keeping us out of the euro, where our prospects would be far worse had we gone in, as was being argued by economist opinion, city opinion, the media opinion, and many others within the government as well. And back in August of last year, he gave a lecture at Bloomberg, and he took head on the Osborne thesis that what was needed was immediate, deep public spending cuts, because that would secure economic recovery, it would boost private investment, because it would encourage confidence. It is a classic fallacy. It's the classic Treasury fallacy that they pushed all the way through the 1930s and the 20s. It's that basic argument between Montague Norman as the governor of the Bank of England and John Maynard Keynes. All the informed opinion was against Keynes' position, but Keynes was right, and he would have been, if they'd adopted his philosophy, then we would have actually got through. And in that era, nearly 80 years ago, in fact, Franklin Roosevelt, in his inaugural address as the President of the United States in 1933, in phraseology that could have been used very much in this debate today, proclaimed that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And that's at a time when the world economic system had collapsed, not only as a result of the Wall Street crash, because remember that happens in 1929, and it's 1931 when the recession really, the world slump starts. Because it was the reaction of finance, it was the reaction of governments, all trying to beggar their neighbour, all trying to cut, all trying to set up trade barriers against each other. It was actually that reaction that brought about the fear, brought about the collapse of the stock market, brought about the reduction of investment, and the nightmare then of the descent into anarchy, and then, for example, the descent into darkness in Germany. Now, in some ways, the prospects in the 1930s could be a bit better, because there was a huge amount of innovation going on, growth of new industries, radio, consumer electrical goods, car and aerospace. It would seem now that actually they see that there's a systemic decline in the rate of major innovation going on right the way across. But to add to that, what was one of George Osborne's first actions but to cut the capital allowances, the tax allowances for investment in equipment and in space, and giving that as a reduction in the corporate tax rate. So in other words, taking money away from the productive industry and moving it to anyone who is making profits by whatever means. Now that is breathtakingly inept, and again it adds to that climate of uncertainty, along with, for example, the dramatic quick change to taxation in North Sea oil, which has led to real uncertainty amongst the oil companies. One, they're very uncertain about some of the projects, but also if the government could act so irrationally, then why would they not act similarly? Why would they not do that again? So all of this uncertainty and fear, and it's based on this fundamental fallacy that was in the previous speaker's contribution, that somehow there are levels of unsustainable debt. That is unhistoric, that's the first thing, but also in the case of the UK, it is not true. We've had Osborne and others saying about Britain, like Greece, being on the net, your gap, your debt level, your borrowing requirement goes up. It is the complete fallacy of that. That is why creating fear, saying that Britain is about to go bankrupt, all of these false arguments, they're affecting the public's willingness to spend, they're affecting industry's willingness to invest, they're also undermining our international position. It's based on a fallacy. That's why the proposition's right.
Deleverage early so that the economy can grow over the medium term. We have to cut back on the government's spending so as to allow the private sector to grow faster over the medium term. And we have to raise the productivity of the economy. The most control that the government has over that is over the productivity of its own spending in the public sector. So we have to have reforms in the public sector that allow public sector productivity to grow faster. And yet, what happens when we have debates in the UK is that we are in what seems to me to be an entirely sterile discussion. I do lots and lots of media debates, and they're almost always against somebody who suggests, look, either we're cutting too fast, or if things go badly, then we should cut less. There's absolutely no possibility of us cutting spending any less if things go badly. Nil, nada. What will happen if things go badly is that we will cut more, as you see all over Europe. Which country? Did you find that Greece decided that their economy went badly, so they thought the solution was we should increase spending? Look at France in the past weeks, right? They've had this problem with their credit rating coming under threat, so that they've had to deal with that. Did they decide, oh well, the solution to that will be doing lots more spending? No, they increased their spending cuts. That's what we're likely to have to do in the UK if things go badly as well. And yet, people are not straight about this. Our whole culture is very arrogant. We look around and we say, look, Ireland's contracted 20% of GDP. Of course, that one can't happen here. Look, France has had to do multiple emergency budgets. Of course, that can't happen here. Look at the Italians. Well, that can't happen here. The Spanish, 7%. That they've had to raise today. Of course, that can't happen here. Our whole culture is a reflection, it's an echo of the culture of the 2010s, our something will turn up culture that we had. If you have a problem, you slap it on the credit card, and something will turn up. If you buy a house and you find that you can't service the debt, well, nobody wants, you've got some buy-to-let mortgage, just leave it out. Something will turn up. That's the way our culture's been for a long time. We haven't escaped from that reality. We continue to believe somehow it's all going to turn out all right in the end. And the reality is that we can make it turn out all right in the end, but only if we face up to the reality of the difficulties that there are there. We continue to believe, the government continues to encourage this in many ways. Although it's shifted slightly from the previous position, it's still far too complacent. The government consistently has made forecasts of growth which are far too high. The government suggests that inflation is going to be lower, and then when it turns out higher, it kind of thinks that that doesn't matter that much, it doesn't need to act. The government's position is not one of having proposed that actually things would be much worse than they've turned out. Consistently, the government has pretended that things would be much better than they have turned out, including this government. We have to have truth, not fear or fantasy. We cannot simply wish ourselves well. The proposer of the motion suggested that, of course, the government can damage things by pretending that the situation is other than it is. That's true, but it works both ways. You can damage things by the government sending out signals that the economy is in a much better state than it really is as well. That encourages people to overextend. People